Darth Vader's transformation into a cyborg after his fateful duel on Mustafar was as much a psychological prison as it was a physical one. However, what if events had unfolded differently? Imagine a scenario where Vader still lost his limbs in the duel, but his body was not consumed by flames. Without the burns that necessitated his respirator and the life support systems in his armor, he would have been spared the agony of constant pain and the audible reminder of his fragility. This partial healing would change the dynamics of Vader's existence in profound ways, altering his relationship with himself, the Force, and the galaxy. Without the horrific burns that scarred every inch of his body, Vader would have retained a closer semblance to his former self. The reliance on his respirator, the haunting mechanical breathing that became synonymous with his presence, would no longer be necessary. Though he would still need prosthetic limbs, the absence of continuous physical suffering could have meant a less deeply entrenched reliance on anger and hatred as his emotional anchors. The dark side of the Force thrives on pain and negative emotion, and Vader's existence as a burnt, pain-racked being provided endless fuel for that fire. Without this constant agony, the strength of his connection to the dark side might have been less overwhelming, potentially leaving a crack in the armor of his psyche that the light could exploit. The psychological toll of Vader's burns cannot be understated. The need to encase himself in a suffocating, isolating suit was a daily reminder of his defeat at Obi-Wan's hands and the loss of everything he held dear: his body, his wife, and his destiny. If Vader had not burned, his physical autonomy would have been greater, even if he remained limbless. This would have allowed him to move more freely and perhaps to feel a greater sense of agency in his own life. Such an existence, less dominated by suffering, might have made him more reflective, less consumed by rage, and more susceptible to the lingering pull of Anakin Skywalker within him. Palpatine's control over Vader was as much psychological as it was based on Vader's dependence on the Emperor's resources for survival. The scars and injuries that plagued him were leveraged by Palpatine to keep Vader in a perpetual state of anger and submission, reinforcing the idea that he had no future or identity outside of being the Emperor's enforcer. If Vader did not require the respirator or the intensive care that his burnt body demanded, he would have been far less dependent on Palpatine's machinations. This shift would have likely led to a more independent Vader, capable of questioning his master's intentions earlier in his journey. The practical aspects of such a partially healed Vader are also worth considering. Without the necessity of the respirator, his armor could have been less bulky and less reliant on cumbersome life support systems. This would have made him a more agile combatant, bringing his skill with a lightsaber closer to his prime as Anakin Skywalker. While his prosthetic limbs would have still posed challenges, they would not have been compounded by the limitations of a heavy, pain-inducing suit. A more mobile and physically capable Vader might have been an even more formidable presence on the battlefield, inspiring greater fear across the galaxy and further solidifying the Empire's grip on its citizens. Additionally, a Vader who did not burn would likely have retained some of the physical features that connected him to his past as Anakin Skywalker. This could have made encounters with those who knew him, such as Ahsoka Tano or Obi-Wan Kenobi, even more emotionally charged. Without the grotesque visage hidden beneath his mask, Vader's confrontation with Luke Skywalker in Return of the Jedi might have played out differently. Luke's eventual realization that Vader was his father relied in part on sensing the man beneath the monster. A less disfigured Vader might have made this connection even more poignant, as the humanity in his appearance could serve as a visual reminder of who he once was. Moreover, Vader's ability to interact with others would have been fundamentally altered. The mechanical rasp of his breathing and the intimidating bulk of his suit were as much tools of psychological warfare as they were necessities for survival. Without these elements, Vader's presence would have been less fearsome but perhaps more commanding in a different way. His voice and demeanor, unfiltered by the mask and respirator, might have carried a more personal, human quality, making his authority as the Emperor's enforcer less reliant on fear and more on the weight of his own conviction. However, even without the burns, it is unlikely that Vader would have been entirely free from the grip of the dark side. The loss of his limbs, the betrayal he felt from the Jedi, and the manipulations of Palpatine would still weigh heavily on him. His fall was not purely the result of physical suffering but also of a deep emotional and spiritual collapse. While the absence of his respirator and constant pain might have softened his reliance on anger, the wounds to his soul would remain, driving his actions and decisions as Darth Vader. This partially healed Vader would still carry the scars of his choices, but his path might have been more open to redemption. The physical reminder of his humanity, his unburned face, his ability to breathe unaided, could have served as a bridge to the part of him that was still Anakin Skywalker. Encounters with his son, Luke, would have had even greater potential to awaken the light within him, as Vader's outward appearance would not entirely mask the man he once was. Ultimately, a Darth Vader who did not burn on Mustafar but still lost his limbs presents a fascinating what-if scenario. It shifts the balance of his existence, reducing his reliance on the dark side and creating opportunities for his inner conflict to surface more readily. This version of Vader, less bound by physical suffering, could have altered not just his own destiny but also the fate of the galaxy, as his choices would have been influenced by a slightly more human perspective. Yet, even in this altered reality, the shadow of the dark side and the scars of his past would still loom large over his path. If Darth Vader had avoided the devastating burns that necessitated his respirator, his overall power and effectiveness would undoubtedly have been enhanced. Perhaps not drastically, but enough to make a noticeable difference. The physical and emotional toll of his injuries served as both a source of strength for his dark side connection and a limiting factor on his full potential. Without the constant agony of a ruined body and the need for bulky life support systems, Vader would have been a more formidable force in the galaxy. One of the key reasons Vader's injuries limited his potential was their impact on his physical prowess. While the dark side allowed him to channel immense power despite his limitations, his suit and respirator inherently restricted his agility and stamina. A version of Vader who did not burn would still rely on prosthetics, but without the restrictive armor and the constant need for mechanical respiration, his movements would have been freer, more fluid. This slight increase in physical capability would not only make him a more dangerous combatant in close quarters, but also allow him to employ the refined lightsaber techniques he mastered as Anakin Skywalker. Even a small improvement in physical capability could amplify Vader's combat effectiveness. His movements in battle, while already terrifying, were somewhat deliberate and calculated because of the constraints of his armor. A less encumbered Vader might have been able to draw more upon his earlier, acrobatic fighting style, combining the ferocity of his dark side-fueled strength with the elegance of his Jedi training. Such a blend of raw power and grace would elevate him from an already daunting foe to an even more lethal opponent, capable of dispatching enemies with greater efficiency and precision. Beyond physicality, the absence of constant, debilitating pain could have also contributed to an increase in Vader's connection to the Force. Pain and suffering were crucial to his use of the dark side, but they were also distractions that divided his focus. Without the ceaseless agony inflicted by his burnt body, Vader could concentrate more fully on channeling the Force, refining his abilities to a greater degree. While he would still draw upon anger, hatred, and the other negative emotions that fueled his power, the absence of physical torment might have allowed him to wield the Force with more clarity and precision, making him slightly stronger overall. This improved control could manifest in his mastery of advanced Force techniques. Vader was already a master of telekinesis, Force choke, and precognitive combat skills, but a healthier body and sharper focus might have allowed him to push these abilities further. For instance, he might have been able to sustain Force-based attacks or defenses for longer periods, or execute them with greater precision and range. These incremental improvements could have tipped the scales in key moments, such as battles against Jedi or clashes with rebel forces, making him even harder to defeat. In addition, Vader's improved physical state would likely have had a psychological impact on those who faced him. While his grotesque appearance and mechanical breathing were effective tools of intimidation, a more physically imposing and agile Vader might have been equally, if not more, terrifying. His ability to dominate the battlefield with speed, power, and precision would project an image of unstoppable might. The fear he inspired would be less about the inhuman monstrosity of his appearance and more about the sheer skill and power he displayed. Furthermore, Vader's relationship with the Emperor would have been subtly altered by this increase in power. While Palpatine deliberately kept Vader in a weakened state, physically dependent and emotionally damaged, an incrementally stronger Vader might have begun to question his master's authority earlier. If Vader had been physically capable of asserting more independence, his ambitions might have grown faster, and his resentment of Palpatine's manipulations could have deepened. This dynamic could have led to a more dangerous Vader, one who was not only physically formidable but also bolder in challenging his master's rule. Even in this altered state, it is important to note that Vader would not have reached the full potential he had as Anakin Skywalker. The loss of his limbs and the mental and emotional scars of his choices would still weigh heavily on him. However, these incremental improvements in his physical and force capabilities would have made him a stronger adversary, a more effective enforcer for the Empire, and an even more significant threat to the Jedi and the Rebel Alliance.